Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Daily Friends Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm here today with Mr. Bheki Mahlobo. Bheki, how's it going?
It's going well, Nick. How's it going for yourself? How's it, Hermann?
It is most excellent and fantastic today. I've got my Earl Grey tea and ready to dive into the news. And we've also got, of course, Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, how are you?
I'm fine. I'm well, thank you. I anticipate this is an episode where most of my contributions will be in the form of facial expressions of exasperation. So let's go.
So that's a message to those who are listening on audio only. Do check us out on YouTube so you can see Hermann's emoting. Hermann actually, you may not know, has a background in performance. I'll leave it to him to say what kind of performance. But that's where the value in this episode will be. Anyway, so we've got a lot to talk about when it comes to roads. This is a cliche of South African politics, is particularly for people in the middle class. It's people complaining about potholes. It's so common. People make jokes about. You can find a million cartoons of South Africans making fun of the fact that our roads aren't really that great, despite the fact that they are still probably better than all the other roads in the continent. South Africa's road infrastructure over the last couple of years has not been doing so well. So I want to look in on two specific examples. Let's start firstly with the municipality level, and this is the city of Johannesburg. So there was a story on, I think it was MoneyWeb, which it was an editor, or it was an op-ed, which just talked about some of the problems with the Johannesburg Roads Agency, which is the entity responsible for repairing South Africa's roads. Of course, Joburg, for the last couple of months, has been governed by a coalition government consisting of the DA, Action SA, and some of the other smaller parties. I think the IFP is also in there, and others, and the ACDP and COPE. And some of the things this editorial talks about is how it seems like the Johannesburg Roads Agency has not been working at full shifts since the beginning of the pandemic. Now, it's not entirely clear why this is. It seems to have been related to COVID regulations or something from the hard lockdown that never appear to have been lifted, at least until relatively recently, when the coalition government seems to have ordered full work to resume. But this editorial, or rather this op-ed, claims that JRA staff were working 1 week on, 1 week off, and have been so since sometime in 2020, which perhaps explains why there's so many potholes and damaged traffic lights and things around Johannesburg. And it's also that the situation has been so bad that the private sector has stepped in, and Discovery and Dial Direct, supposedly in conjunction with the city, but more or less just with the city's permission, not really with their help, launched a pothole patrol app, which would allow people to report potholes and then would be filled in basically by contractors, I think funded by the private sector. Of course, the city did actually have its own app that did exactly the same thing, but it was never... It just stopped working, or it wasn't properly acted upon, because, like so many of government's e-services, it really wasn't in great condition. Very possibly the tender lapsed or something like that. Anyway, so I don't know. Let me start with you, Hermann. How did we get here with the road situation?
Well, I think part of the problem is that nobody really knows. Nobody really knows at what point was this partial capacity functioning of JRA approved, why it was approved, and so part of the problem of how did we get here is it's a bit of a mystery. It gives reality to the old joke of walking past the some state department and the young boy asks his father how many people work in that building, and the answer is about half of them. It's like literally applicable here. So part of the problem is that there's, I think, some unclear elements here as to what happened to the insourcing and outsourcing borders and delineations of where we are with contracting tenders within the metropolitan jurisdiction and out of it. And Hermann Mahlobo, of course, being very, very proud of his insourcing scheme that was aborted midway through because of his petulant tantrum and his storming out of the mayoral office. But just part of the problem is, I think, I would boil it down to three things. Is number one, people get the politicians they vote for, and people who don't vote get the politicians other people vote for. So I think there's a problem here that we sort of, South African voters have set us up for something of a lashing. Number two, we have the ANC in collapse. We have the fact that their talent pool is smaller and becoming smaller and smaller and smaller, because 10, 15 years ago, municipal governance by the ANC wasn't awful. I mean, there were legitimately some municipalities in
at least in the metros, I would say.
Yes, at least in the metros that were run quite well. So number one is the uninvolvement of the electorate, and the just not caring too much about politics, because what would politics ever affect human lives? It's not as if Eskom and roads and crime and water and these things have political dimensions. So why bother about politics? Number two, the collapse of the ANC, and then number three is just the sort of poor nature of administrative competence in the civil service of our local municipalities. It doesn't necessarily have to be a political problem, but, and Nick, as you said before the show, if any government really wants to change this, there would need to be a wholesale restructuring of such significant parts of the civil service of the municipal government structures that it cannot really be executed without an overwhelming electoral mandate. So coalition government like the one currently in place have difficulty in trying to fix all three of those problems because they just don't have the real mandate and the electoral power.
So I'll give an example, which I told you guys just before the show, but it's probably worth sharing. And this is the story of when I was a ward councillor, which I was briefly for just over a year in the city of Johannesburg, and my interactions with the Johannesburg Roads Agency. So in my area, there was a depot, which had a depot manager, and as a ward councillor, this was supposed to be the person that you go to when your residents complain and they say, look, there's a pothole here, I reported it and it hasn't been fixed, or this road is really badly surfaced, when is it going to be resurfaced? You go to the depot manager to ask them for information, maybe ask them if they're attending to it, let them check if they actually know about the problem, despite the fact that it's been reported, that kind of thing. Well, my depot manager never responded to any communication I sent her for about a year, at which point I discovered that she had been placed on what was called stress leave, and it was not clear who was in charge or who had been made to replace her. I think eventually she was not fired, not put back to work, but moved to a different job, and a new depot manager came in. Bheki, am I right in saying that that kind of says it all about why our civil service at all levels doesn't seem to work?
Yeah, most definitely, Nick. In fact, I would advise a particular individual that would be interested in taking this task to either take a taxi towards Johannesburg or simply drive towards Johannesburg, because I spend a large proportion of my time traveling within the city of Johannesburg. And I can tell you right now, the state of the roads right now is in a really great decline. In fact, you will find it quite hard for you to off-ramp from the highway towards the city and just continue your way to the city without making U-turns and try to avoid potholes, because that's how disastrous the effect is. And the city is just a best case example of the decline in public service in terms of a local level as well as a national level, because you'll see the decline in the roads infrastructure. In fact, one of the roads is so badly maintained that you actually need to slow down, otherwise you're going to puncture your tires and so forth. And you can see these issues at play here, where you can see massive levels of people on the streets without having jobs, homelessness, high crime levels. I cannot recall how many times I've been jacked in the streets of Jersey. But all these issues really speak to the broader issue of the decline in public service in the country, both from a local level as well as that from a national level. And the only way out of that is increased levels of accountability.
Right,
and might I add something to that as well? It is increased levels of accountability, but also it's quite often difficult to argue against cadre deployment in the public sphere, because in a weird way, cadre deployment is seen as this victimless crime. It's the consequences of this policy are two steps removed, because you can't necessarily identify this thing, this pit toilet was not broken because, or was not built because of cadre deployment. But when you look at the civil service, cadre deployment is probably responsible for 70 to 80% of the nonsense that goes on there. So if ever you want to understand why people like Leon Schreiber and people like the IRR, way back, years ago, when this thing became policy under Mbeki, if you ever want to understand why people are against cadre deployment, you must understand that the main deploying area of cadre deployment is the civil service. So the civil service isn't just shocking because it is staffed by incompetent nincompoops. It is shocking because it cannot be staffed by anyone else. Therefore, the only thing you are left with are cadre nincompoops. So if you ever want to understand what the real world consequences of cadre deployment is, not just the fuzzy-wuzzy theory of the blurring of the lines between government and state, or party and government, or executive. No. If you want to look at the real consequences of cadre deployment, find your nearest pothole and stare at it. You'll be looking at the consequences of cadre deployment.
And lest we think that this is a Joburg only problem, and as anyone looking at the live comments on YouTube can tell, this is certainly not only a Joburg deployment, but I think it's generally been true that South Africa's at least national roads have been in a better state, and probably still are in general. But Transport Minister Fikile Mbalula, who is of course responsible for South Africa's road infrastructure network and has been for some time, sounding a lot like an opposition politician. He's warned that South Africa could soon face a disaster which he says would be on par with the infrastructure crisis that we see with Eskom. Answering questions in a parliamentary committee meeting on this yesterday, Mbalula said that important money required for road maintenance was being used to service debt that had been built up by, in this case, the failed e-toll project. He said, quote, "I'm sitting here with roads that are not going to be maintained for the next year. The second phase of the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project has come to an abrupt standstill, and there's going to be serious congestion in the next 5 to 10 years, starting in Gauteng. It's going to be the biggest disaster you have ever seen, with roads not being fixed and maintained because we do not have the money to do it." Mbalula laid the blame on former Finance Minister Tito Mboweni, who he said had failed to offer a solution to the e-toll scheme, which contributed to the growing debt problems. And then he said, quote, "It will have dire consequences for this country, the same as we have dire problems of electricity." Well, I'm glad that Fikile Mbalula is being, it seems, fairly honest with us here. There was the same story that I got this quote from also mentions that a consulting firm called Frost & Sullivan found that more than half of South Africa's unpaved road network is in poor to very poor condition, and that about a third of South Africa's paved road network is also in poor to very poor condition. I'm glad the minister is pretty being blunt here. It's one of Fikile Mbalula's few strengths, is that he can be somewhat to the point sometimes. But I kind of feel like he maybe should be doing something about it, considering he's been transport minister for years, or for a while at least. Herman, what do you say about this?
Yeah, so Fikile Mbalula has been transport minister since 2019. He's been the minister responsible for transport longer than I've been at the IRR. So it just for my own personal context there, in this time, I can point at a few things I've done and not done and messed up, but it's spectacular. It is utterly spectacular that this man can be the minister announcing to the world that I'm incompetent. I'm so incompetent that my portfolio is now an existential threat to the nature of our country and our economy. And it's cute that he tries to blame shift. And one of the things that he tries to blame shift towards Tito Mboweni, who, didn't cover himself in glory as Minister of Finance, but he says that no, Minister Mboweni spent too much money on debt servicing. I wonder where the debt came from that we needed to service in the first place. Is it possibly part of ANC policy ever since 2009 to essentially explode the budget deficit of South Africa to such a point that we literally pay more in annual debt servicing costs than we pay on our entire healthcare system? And how about a few billion rand there from the VIP protection budget that's been allocated? Right. So it's just so.
And, of course, he's also very specifically blaming e-tolls, but it's not like, I'm pretty sure I remember. So I was still a teenager, I think, when the e-tolls project was being discussed as to be rolled out, and I'm pretty sure that everything that's happened since was pointed out by civil society and the opposition, including groups like ALTA.
Yes, and whenever people say, procedural complaints about public participation are just fluffy things, part of why e-tolls is such a disaster is the public participation element of passing it into actual government policy wasn't followed properly. There wasn't proper public consultation. There wasn't proper consideration of alternatives. So e-toll is a disaster, but it isn't a disaster that has led to this disaster, which we call Fikile Mbalula. It might be a contributing factor, but isn't it just so precious that it is everyone's fault except the minister who's been in charge of this portfolio? It's e-tolls, it's Tito Mboweni, it's the debt servicing. My goodness, I'm surprised Pravin Gordhan didn't get a tongue lashing. Well, he should. At least he blew up South Africa's deficit. But the pathetic incompetence of this lesbian-looking prime minister, minister trying to blame shift to a point so that we forget how useless he's been in every single ministerial office he's ever held. I mean, it's just precious. It is precious. We laugh because we cannot cry, but we're pretty close to crying in any case.
Bheki, your thoughts on the minister's comments, and also I think maybe it might be worth talking a little bit about why this actually matters. Why does our road network matter? Why do potholes matter? These things. What effect does it have on the economy?
Yeah, Hermann is absolutely correct in the sense where you start to have an increase in debt levels, your debt servicing costs then increase, and then that takes away funds from more important things, like in this example, in maintenance of infrastructure, healthcare, education, and so forth. And the reason why it's important is that the road as well as infrastructure in general allow individuals as well as businesses to take themselves from point A to point B. For households, it's them getting to work. For business, it's the transportation of goods. Case in point, for example, is what happened to Clover in the Northwest, where there was such poor road maintenance that they had to actually also close their businesses because they couldn't, for example, transport their goods. They couldn't get enough electricity to manufacture cheese, which needs a constant stream of electricity, and therefore they needed to move to a municipality that would be more competent in terms of providing those services. And that's particularly the importance of infrastructure there, Nick, is that it negatively, if you have declining infrastructure, it negatively impacts the performance of the country. But not only that, but it also leaves it quite vulnerable. If you recall last year in July, the transportation of goods by trucks, where there was July riots, and most of them were burnt because our rail infrastructure is so badly maintained that they need to be on the highways in order to transport goods. So that is the importance of infrastructure, the transportation of goods. And if it's not properly maintained, that you're also hampering the economic performance of the country.
And the departure of Clover from that municipality cost 800 jobs. 800 livelihoods destroyed. And if we look at the reality that for every job you have about 4 dependents in South Africa, what's 8 times 4? It's 3,200 people now without a source of income because of the failure to actually maintain infrastructure. These aren't victimless crimes. A pothole isn't just an annoyance. It kills jobs, which impoverishes people. And, poverty is the greatest killer in history.
Exactly.
Indeed. I must apologize as a thunderstorm has just started and you may hear it on the mic while I'm talking. But anyway, we will boldly go forward because the weather shall not stop us. Yeah, I think it's there's this tendency occasionally to talk about road infrastructure as though it's a quote unquote middle class concern. But as you guys have just pointed out, that is very much not the case. It actually, the people who get, to use a phrase, screwed over the worst are, as usual in South Africa, the poorest of the poor. Right, let's move on to our next story. And this is about the city of Cape Town. So the mayor of Cape Town, Jordan Hill-Lewis, was speaking at a Solar Power Africa conference hosted at the Cape Town International Convention Center. And he said that Cape Town had been drawing up plans to add another 350 megawatts of renewable energy to the city's infrastructure. The city uses about, he said, 2,000 megawatts of electricity. And the purpose of this is to attempt to reduce load shedding and dependence on Eskom in general. So that's very interesting. But there's a second part to this, which is that while they're getting from anyone, I think, who is basically willing to sell them electricity, most of the projects that they're focusing on funding right now do seem to be solar powered, which was why he was discussing this at the solar conference. Bheki, what do you think of the upsides and the downsides of this?
Well, the upside is less reliance on Eskom, which would be good for Cape Town, the city of Cape Town, in terms of, for example, households, South African households, as well as that for businesses in general. That's the upside that I see. But in general, what I do tend to see with Cape Town is that they are usually at a lower load shedding schedule compared to the rest of the country, largely due to the policies that is followed by the administration there in the city of Cape Town, which is a good thing. And this will greatly increase the dependence on Eskom and hopefully reduce load shedding in that city, which would make Cape Town actually an economic hub, incentivize businesses to start their operations there, create more jobs there, which is a great thing. The negative aspect that I would comment on there is the increase in solar energy, which tends to be more expensive compared to fossil fuels. For example, Eskom relies 90% of electricity generated from coal. And if you are looking at it if you compare that to solar energy tends to be more expensive and it has less reliance on solar energy and so forth. And the consequence of that is that people that stay in Cape Town will pay more pay more for electricity compared to when they were less reliant on solar energy. But I think this is much more of a broader move where you see in other countries where there's this broader shift towards green energy, likely from two fronts. Likely, it's mainly driven ideologically, where there's now a guilt associated with fossil fuels, and now the world needs to transition towards solar energy. And now that it's also translated to investment matrix, such as when you look at ESG, where now you're forced to transition to solar energy, otherwise you'd be punished in forms of investment. That is perhaps another reason, another note that the Cape Town government is also having a look at. But the overall consequence here, Nicholas, I'm inviting you.
Just because we both have beards doesn't mean we're the same person.
It's the beards, man. It's the beards. Mine is also on the way there. The consequence of that is that consumers in the city of Cape Town will pay more for electricity. And there are examples of which, such as that in Germany, where they would not like that. Because it will be more expensive for them to go about their daily lives.
Exactly. Hermann, go ahead.
There's something very dangerous here for the DA. And this is sort of where you, if you start understanding that liberalism in South Africa has British influences and American influences. American liberalism is broadly aligned with the left, where British liberalism is either centrist or broadly aligned with the right. And the DA going back to the DP, going back to the PFP, have traditionally been on the liberal side when it comes to British ideology. So it was the idea is that Margaret Thatcher was a British liberal, where Ronald Reagan was an American conservative, but they sort of believed the same thing. American liberalism, British liberalism, not the same thing. In this policy, we are seeing a dangerous conflict where the virtue signaling of progressive liberalism intrudes on the free market pragmatism of British liberalism, where a proper liberal party, depending on where you define liberalism from, could be either seen as hectically pro green energy and, no matter the market costs, or against it because of the market costs. And it's worth remembering that fossil fuels saved the whale. It was before fossil fuels became commercially viable, it was the case that blubber and whale fat was widely used for its fuel aspect in fueling lamps and things like that. And because fossil fuels became commercially viable, it actually saved the whale, because that diminished the commercial viability of the whale trade. So fossil fuels saved the whale, and it was in that case actually good for the environment because we had this progress. But now we've got this dangerous conflict of two forms of liberalism. One where you say, let's decentralize, get away from centralized command economy kind of stuff, which is, get away from Eskom, give power to the people, or give the power to people to generate their own power. But also this dodgy virtue signaling, liberal progressivism, where it has to be green energy because green energy, it's the closest we come to a secular confession these days. This is a danger for the DA, and it is a real ideological constraint that they would need to overcome at some point, because you cannot have it both ways. At some point, something's got to give. But this is a complex situation. I know the city about 4 years ago became very criticized for 7,000 Rand fine on unregistered solar panels, and people on the economic right who are in favor of free market said, this is awful and terrible, this is so unfair. But there are some real legitimate points about the stability of the electricity grid. However, if you really want to go and shoot yourself in the foot that you cannot get rates and taxes and water and electricity income as a municipality, you encourage people to go off-grid completely by just severing their ties, and you shoot yourself in the foot because you get no income. Long and short of it is, there's a conflict of liberalism here, two strains of liberalism. One needs to resolve. The one will be economically beneficial. The other one will signal such virtue, so much virtue.
All right. As the sky falls down upon me, Bheki, your final thoughts on this issue before we close up for today?
Final thoughts of this issue here, Nick, is just really from, firstly, like Hermann, just amazing comment there. The final comment here, Nick, is that I think from an economical perspective, right, is that I would not necessarily demonize social green energy, for example, but looking at it from a price perspective, it does often involve in increased prices for consumers, which is something they generally do not like, especially in a context where income levels have largely stagnated for the past 10 years. A lot of people have not been able to be. Yeah, sorry.
It is worth pointing out. Sorry. No. Sorry. Just to interrupt you. It is, of course, worth pointing out that while Germany and the UK maybe can afford some increases in their electricity price, South Africa is not quite in the same place.
Definitely not. In fact, if you look at employment levels, we're still about 2 million people short in the employment category when you're comparing the third quarter of 2019 compared to the latest data available, which is the third quarter of 2021. So you can largely see that. Also, if you're looking at GDP per capita, lower now when Thabo Mbeki left office in 2007. So South Africa does not have this income levels comparable to, for example, what you said there, Nick, with European countries that may be able to afford, even though it does come with a pinch, higher electricity prices. At this point, I would not say that South African citizens can afford to pay that bill. And that does come with consequences.
Indeed so. There is another thing on this I want to discuss, but I don't think we have time. So I'm just going to very briefly mention a op-ed written by the Deputy Finance Minister that Bheki drew my attention to. And that was, of course, our Deputy Finance Minister is David Musondo. And this op-ed says that structural reforms are very much here. And if you can't see them, you're just not paying attention. And he goes at length to describe what he calls Operation Vulindlela, which is a government project that he is supposed to be in charge of to find all these great structural reforms and enforce them. He mentions raising the threshold for electricity from 1 megawatt to 100 megawatt for sort of private generation that mines and other large electricity consumers have been asking for. And he talks about a lot of other projects which are supposed to be coming online. Bheki, very briefly, your thoughts on this.
I'll make this quite brief. There's this interesting thing that I'm seeing within the ANC where, for example, if you look at the State of the Nation address by the president, where he actually did touch on certain key areas that needs to be reformed. And he did make talk in terms of those particular directions. But they would say and try to implement or so-called these forms of reforms, which I would call fidgeting around the edges, the release of spectrum, which is needed, reduction in red tape for businesses, which is definitely needed. But at the same time, follow policies that will be detrimental for the South African economy, such as that of the expropriation without compensation, NHI, employment equity, the Amendment to Employment Equity Act, and so forth. And it's these two annihilating ideas that they continue to hold. And just a point on what the Deputy Finance Minister said in terms of the increase in private generation capacity, they in fact needed to be forced into implementing that. If you recall, that was the week where South Africa experienced massive levels of load shedding. And if they had not done that, then it would still be severe, massive strain to the South African national grid, and it still needs to ramp up. That's not an immediate effect. It will still take time for private businesses to increase their private electricity generation.
Yeah, definitely. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Unfortunately, we've gone a little bit over, but thank you very much to everyone who listened. And thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today. And we'll see you tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show. Cheers, everyone.